Hello, boys and girls. Today we're going to talk about drawing conclusions. Now, we have done this before, but to go along with our story this week about raising the raisin, we are going to talk about how to draw conclusions, okay? So when you draw a conclusion, it says readers can use strong clues to figure out what the author didn't say. So look here, the author told me the smart animal was eating bananas. So I conclude the smart animal was a monkey because this child knows that monkeys eat bananas. So he took what he already knew, that monkeys eat bananas, and put it with what the author said and decided that the monkey was smart. So when you draw conclusions, or when you draw a conclusion, you want to form an opinion based on facts and details that the author gives you and based on what you already know. Okay, boys and girls? So you put those things together. So in How Do You Raise a Raisin story this week, we are going to be talking about how to draw conclusions. Now sometimes they might say making inferences, and that means basically the same thing as drawing conclusions. Making inferences means you use what you know and what the author said to figure something out that the author didn't say. It says, I can make connections from what I know to the story. So you use your prior knowledge, what you already know, and you take what the author tells you and you come up with a conclusion or you make inferences. Alright, so drawing conclusions is one of the skills this week. We have this paper. If you have this paper, please get it. It's page 148. There's Raise a Raisin at the top, says draw conclusions. We will read this and do it together. To go over the skill, draw conclusions. A conclusion is a decision you reach after thinking about facts and details you read. Okay, so you read facts and details. You can also use what you already know to help draw a conclusion. What you already know is called prior knowledge. It's what you already have up there in your brain. Then you can ask yourself, does my conclusion make sense? So you read for facts and details, you use that information, you use the information you already have, and then you put together a conclusion, and then you say to yourself, does my conclusion make sense? Okay, if your conclusion doesn't make sense, maybe you need to go back and reread. Alright, we're going to read this passage and then answer the questions. I'm going to read the passage and then answer the questions. It says, one day Miranda had the idea that she would like to grow her own flowers. She had never gardened before, but she couldn't imagine what could be so difficult about it. So Miranda went to the store and bought seeds. She came home and planted them in her yard, and in a few days, flowers began to sprout. Miranda also noticed something else sprouting, weeds. She tried to pull up the nasty weeds, but she accidentally pulled up some of her flowers too. To help the surviving flowers, Miranda thought she should water the garden. So she turned on the hose to give them a drink. However, she got distracted and walked away while the hose was still on. Water filled her garden until all that was left of her garden was a big mud puddle. Okay, so we're going to read that one more time and then answer our questions. Get something to help me follow along better. Okay. One day Miranda had the idea that she would like to grow her own flowers. She had never gardened before, but she couldn't imagine what could be so difficult about it. So Miranda went to the store and bought seeds. She came home and planted them in her yard, and in a few days, flowers began to sprout. Miranda also noticed something else sprouting, weeds. She tried to pull up the nasty weeds, but she accidentally pulled up some of her flowers too. To help the surviving flowers, Miranda thought she should water the garden. so she turned on the hose to give them a drink. However, she got distracted and walked away while the hose was still on. Water filled her garden until all that was left of her garden was a big mud puddle. Okay, reading it again helped me understand it better. So now it says, what happens when Miranda weeds her garden? Well, what happened? She decided she needs to weed her garden. So when you have a garden, you pull the weeds out so the plants can grow better. But what happened when Miranda did it? You're right. Miranda, she accidentally pulled up some of her flowers. She wanted to pull just the weeds and she accidentally pulled up some of her flowers. So what happened? She pulls up flowers instead of weeds. Okay, write that in for number 1. Number 2 says, what happens when Miranda waters her garden? So she tried to pull weeds to help take care of her flowers in her garden. She decided she needed to water it because those are 2 things that are good, pulling weeds, watering flowers. So if we look back here, it says she turns on the hose to give them a drink. That's where she waters them. However, she got distracted and she walked away while the hose was still on. So what happened? Water filled her garden until all that was left was a big puddle. So Miranda left the water hose on too long. So what happens when Miranda waters her garden? She leaves the water hose on too long. So remember back it said Miranda thought she'd grow some flowers and she couldn't imagine it would be difficult. Seems like she's having some difficulty, doesn't it? Okay, number 1, what happens when Miranda weeds her garden? She pulls up flowers instead of weeds. Number 2, what happens when Miranda waters her garden? She leaves the water hose on too long. These are facts and details. These are from the story. We took those straight from the story. Well, number 3 wants a conclusion. So conclusion will take things from the story and what we already know. See, it says number 3, what conclusion can you draw about Miranda's gardening skills? Okay, now knowing what she has done, pulled flowers instead of weeds, left the hose on too long and pretty much flooded her flowers. What do we think about Miranda's gardening skills? Skills, how good is she at it? Or is she good at it? What do you think, boys and girls? You're right. Miranda is not a very good gardener. We can draw that conclusion because we see what she has done here. It's not good things. She just hasn't learned. She can learn, but obviously she hasn't learned yet. So as of right now, Miranda is not a very good gardener. She can become a good gardener if she's taught, and she'll learn. But as of right now, her skills aren't very good with gardening. That's our conclusion. We can draw that conclusion from what we know, from what she did, and from the facts. Miranda is not a very good gardener. Now, does our conclusion make sense? Yes or no? And then we have to tell why it makes sense if we think it does. Well, does it make sense? I would say yes, it makes sense. But we have to tell why. So why do you think it makes sense? Us saying that Miranda is not a good gardener? Why does that make sense? Well, there are 2 sentences in this story that show that Miranda is doing the wrong things. So if she's doing the wrong thing, she's not a good gardener. If she was doing the right things, we'd think she was good at it. But our conclusion makes sense because there are two sentences in the story that show Miranda doing the wrong things. So that pretty much proves and goes along with my conclusion. The conclusion that we came up with. The conclusion that says Miranda's not a good gardener. Because these sentences tell things that she did that she shouldn't have done. I know that from prior knowledge because I know I like gardening and I love flowers. And I know, yes, it's good to weed them. And yes, you have to water them. But you can't pull them out instead of the weeds. That's not a good thing. And you can't flood them out with water. So Miranda at this point, maybe she'll learn. But we drew the conclusion that she's not a good gardener. And we know that that's true because these sentences are details that go and facts that go along with it from the story that proves at this point we can draw the conclusion safely that she is not a good gardener. All right, thank you, boys and girls. Now remember, in drawing conclusions, you're going to use things from the story like we did from the passage and what you already know to draw a conclusion that makes sense. Have a great day, boys and girls.